I think they give us an interesting view into you know, what our Hoffs would have been like in, 50 years before we start seeing the stave churches. So I think that's an interesting thing. Certainly we see that architecturally and in design with all of the different gripping beast motifs and the like dragon imagery and a lot of those things. But you also see use, you see this transition with use of runes. So you see runes from the Austertrue period, but you also start seeing those runes take on Christian themes and Christian motifs to where you're using these inherently pagan magical sigils as a writing script for, Bible stories or, adorned with crucifixes and things that way. You see that crossover on like early medieval rune stones a lot too. You see that specifically in Sweden. Really prominently, you see that in Uppsala, and I don't mean in old Uppsala, but in the modern city of Uppsala, near their, I think they've got a cathedral there. You see a lot of rune stones there that are overtly Christian, but done in a very Austertrue way. And okay, so another thing that he mentioned is some of the holdovers from the Austertrue period are the Battle of Lena. Odin appears to King Eric to bring victory. You see that, and you see elements of that into, as you point out, into medieval times. And what you also see is along the fringes, invocations of Austertrue themes and Austertrue gods, along with Christian saints and Jesus with charms and like low magic things. And you see that for a long period of time in Western Europe. And some of it's more overt than others. There's a lot of theories about various folklore and its relationship to the old religion, and it's kind of it's kind of a thing that I think we're familiar with, is the person who finds themselves sick and they're just reaching out for any kind of help. They're like, I need a healing charm, so I'll pray to Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha and whatever random other gods they put in there, just hoping that, if they throw it out there enough, somebody's going to listen. It sounds silly, but desperate people do those things. And people who are in isolated rural populations and aren't very well educated don't necessarily get the difference. It was relatively late to where the Bible or Christian scripture was in a form that the average person could read and could, really think about. So their Christian instruction was marginal at best, depending on the missionaries that were talking to them or, what they were able to figure out. So a lot of the times they didn't get it. They would add, we see this in a lot of places. There was people would have an altar to Jesus along with their altars to Odin and other things. You see that in Anglo-Saxon England during the transition period there as well. You see in Iceland, very famously, hammers. They'll have like a dude whose hammer mold is on the same mold that his crucifix mold is, because you've got that crossover of things, and they weren't, by the average guy living out in the woods, they weren't necessarily mutually exclusive because they didn't know any better. The very sharp distinction came the more that official church infrastructure got out into the rural populations. And that took much, much longer. Like you're talking here about the things you reference in 1177 and 1208 respectively. Those I don't know what official date Sweden counts their Christianization, but I think both of those are about 100 years past that date. So it hung around there for quite a bit. So along kind of a similar theme. All right, along a similar theme, we have a new member, Amber. Welcome, Amber. We're glad that you're here. Glad to see you're on here. She asked, why do people call Baldr the Norse Jesus? Is it because he comes back after Ragnarok? Or is there something in the lore that indicates Baldr has some similar teachings or aspects as Jesus? Trent, what say you?
No, Baldr does not have similar teachings to Jesus. That came about because when the Christianization was happening and these monks were going all over Northern Europe specifically and Western Europe, they would go to the Germanic and Celtic lands in particular. And, the warband was such a central part of Germanic and Celtic society, especially Germanic. And so these priests, these missionaries would come and they would say, oh, hey, Jesus was a warrior too. Yeah, he led his own war band. You guys have to worship him. You guys love war bands, right? And so Jesus was depicted to the Anglo-Saxons specifically as a Drighten or Drichten, a leader of a war band. And so they kind of connected that to Baldr because we have evidence that an earlier source material that's kind of lost to us now, that Baldr was, besides being bright and shining and loved by all, he was a war god. He was bold in battle and joyous and generous and all these things. And Jesus was said to be generous, obviously, and joyous, etc., etc. And so when they added that, Jesus was a warband leader, it tied him a little closer to Baldr, I suppose. And so our ancestors, the plan at least, was for our ancestors to go, oh, this Jesus guy sounds just like Lord Baldr, So that's pretty much how we got there. They're both depicted as white guys with long, blonde, brown hair. So there's that too, I guess. But that's pretty much it. It's just a result of the Christianization. They had to connect Jesus to our faith. That was the best way. And it goes back to the earlier topic, just how we, the Catholics have hero worship, essentially, when they venerate these saints. We have our, each of our Heiliger Mother, Queen Sigrid or Eil Skallagrimson. Those are saints, essentially.
So that's part of it. Another part of it is, and this is along a similar thing that Trent mentioned, but one of the ways that missionaries used to convert to Christianity is likening, you had to liken it to something these people knew and had a familiarity with. You can't talk to them about, ancient Jewish desert stuff. That imagery doesn't make sense to people who've never left, their small little alpine valley or wherever they find themselves. So you use things they do know. And there's the point of similarity you mentioned about coming back after Ragnarok, and that's part of it. The idea that the best and brightest of the Aesir is slain, dies, and is reborn. They use that to liken to Jesus and to transition to Jesus. And it's a funny thing because the concept of God's doing that very thing, triumphing over death in that way is not a Jesus thing. Jesus is kind of one of the latest in a long line of that. You see a lot of that in Egyptian mythology. You see You see it in a number of other places. So at the time, I think that was utilized as a way of explaining Jesus, but I think we have two different phenomena. So you have you have early medieval missionaries that make that connection. But what you also have is modern, late 20th century Alsatruar that like to make that comparison as well. There's like an academic fetishism to, if you find anything in the Lord that's similar to something that Christians do, then it must be some kind of Christian distortion of our traditions. And I think that's lazy, and I think it's just convenient. I think they see that. Certainly early scholars see that as a point of commonality. And it's easy if that's your touchstone. If your familiarity is with Bible stories and with Christianity, to see any similarity in any other thing you study as, oh, it must be that. And people have always done that. Our brains are wired to pick up on patterns. And so it's very tempting if you, all right, this is another theme on this show that we talk about a lot, is the difference between how a religious person processes information versus a scholar looking outside at some strange practice of a foreign people or an ancient people. But often we don't talk about it from this angle. We talk about how a scholar writing about the tales of our ancestors and about Alsatru religion and the Aesir doesn't start off with a belief that these are actual gods and this is an actual faith. They treat it as, strange superstitions by primitive people. And so I juxtapose it as the atheist academic to the religious Alsatruar, but that's not the whole story. What else we have, especially by the early scholars that were examining our ancestral faith, they didn't come from a place of atheism. They came from a place of belief in Christianity. If you believe your Bible story, then when you process anyone else's superstitions and religions, when you see something that has a point of similarity, I know what that is. That's just these strange people's interpretation of Jesus. That's these strange people's interpretation of Noah's flood. You see everything through your Christian lens. And that, I think, overplayed a lot of early scholars' analysis of things because they didn't have the other points of reference. Their point of reference was what they believed to be true, that their God created everything and that their timeline for all of these things is recorded in their Bible, and that all of the peoples of the earth are descendants of Adam and Eve and Noah, and they put it in that context. If that is the case, then clearly all of these other people are just confused about their religion, and any of their stories that sound similar are truths that have been able to somehow make it through their confused, their confused perceptions. So I think that overplays it a lot. The other thing we had, especially of people who practice Alsatru in the late 20th century, you have a big movement of trying to break with Christianity. So there was like this zealousness of going through anything in our lore that you found similar to anything that Christians do and having to excise it or whatever, because at that point we weren't conceiving of Alsatru as an independent faith. We were conceiving of Alsatru as the anti-Christianity. And again, and this is why I say we. Earlier in the show, I kind of talked about everybody comes from a different place. I'm not speaking disparagingly about anybody. We start where we start. The idea is that we advance and move forward. I think that the process of that hard break with Christianity was necessary. But as we've matured as a faith and as we've matured as individuals, we've come to realize that Alsatru doesn't have anything to do with Christianity. It is an independent, its own thing that stands on its own merits, not in the ways that it either, compares or contrasts with another foreign faith. And I think that's, a much more authentic way of understanding that. You'll find similarities between Jesus and a number of different gods of different pagan traditions. I think there's a case to be made that Jesus might be a reflection of that, as some of those are older than Christianity. But I think it's also true that that's a common theme in various people's mythos, and that's not necessarily connected. Sometimes things just happen in parallel, and when it is politically advantageous to us, it's very easy to jump on similarities and exploit similarities, sometimes maliciously and sometimes with the best of intention. But I think that our brain likes to pick up those patterns and see that.
Walking through M. You're fucking retarded!
Volar hasta el cielo, siempre en alto. La verdad se sabrá con el triunfo del mañana. Alumbra el camino, brillará esa luz, es la de Soldier Drill. Con fuerza y con valor, activando el cosmos, el mundo brillará. Tan solo di que sí, Sensei. Sabrás conmigo que es la libertad. Vive tus sueños y llegarás al Sensei. Sabrás conmigo que es la libertad. Vive tus sueños y llegarás al fin.
Idiots! I'm surrounded by idiots!